All right. This is your Gaza War Sit Rep day 160. Um, and today there's some news from the fronts, and mostly I want to talk to you about Yemen and Ansarallah, who made a gigantic announcement today. And then, in light of that announcement, I think I'll talk to you a little bit about the concept of escalation, and how escalation works in a context like this one. Okay, so let's start with all the other fronts because, well, we have in the West Bank news from one of the organizations about a gunfight in Tulkarm, another one of the West Bank towns, surrounded by uh, the wall. Tulkarm, one of the resistance groups, announced a gunfight in Tulkarm against Israeli forces. We have in Gaza a couple of things to note. Fighting in Khan Yunis, Martyr Omar al Qasim forces uh, announced that they hit two military vehicles with the rocket propelled grenade, Yasin 105 rocket propelled grenades. The other thing that people have been sharing today with some degree of whether the word is amusement or amazement is that apparently Hamas has launched a podcast where the intended listeners are also Hamas members, and they talk about resistance topics and give each other pointers on the use of weapons. I have not seen or listened to this podcast, but I have heard of its existence and seen a screenshot of it, and it does remind me of um, this old meme that I saw. You may have seen this meme. The meme goes, Allah, the men you put, some variation of this, Allah, the men you put on this earth to build houses are making podcasts, or the men you put on this earth to provide and protect, provide for us and protect are making podcasts instead. So I think that's kind of a moment of levity, I suppose, in this horrific situation that we're in. And that to hear about this podcast by resistance factions. So the other thing is, one of you listeners have, because I've been talking about the peer concept, some listeners shared with me the Colonial Outcast podcast with Greg Stoker, and he had a guest on from Cyprus, and they were talking about the various energy corridor, gas, offshore gas pipeline kinds of ideas behind the construction of a pier. And then someone else, thank you to this commenter who referred me to the Chris Gunnis being interviewed by Moin Rabbani. And Chris Gunnis basically, if I understood him correctly, was having a kind of a good faith interpretation of the pier. He said that, but he was talking about two different piers. He said there's a pier in the north and then the US pier. And he said the pier in the north is about to unload many tons of food supplies, pulses, grains, rice, I don't know, meals. He's talking about hundreds of thousands of food for hundreds of thousands of people being arriving today or tonight or tomorrow or something. So I suppose if he's right, we'll know pretty soon. And I don't think he's right. And I would love to be proved wrong, but I don't think he's right. I don't think that Israel would allow that. I don't understand. And he seems to think that because Israel is in jeopardy under the International Court of Justice, that they're going to allow this. I just don't. And he says he understands the situation on the ground, but I just don't think that it didn't sound to me like he has more experience than me and so on, but it didn't sound to me like he understands either the Israeli agenda or Israel's power to stop or to attack people distributing aid. There were just a lot of things that I don't think his analysis took into account. So again, hope to be proved wrong. Soon we will find out one way or another. Hamas announced that it's the 20th consecutive day of Israel targeting people trying to get food. So I don't know. I mean, if Israel has tanks and at this point today, Apache helicopters waiting to ambush civilians who are trying to get food, particularly at the Kuwaiti roundabout, I think it's called, in Gaza City. I don't know. I think that becomes a static position that'll sooner or later be targeted by the resistance, but I suppose we'll see about that as well. But I don't know if I would go so far as to call that a prediction, but I do see that as something that is increasingly likely the more these massacres go on, with nobody else being able to do anything about it. So Hezbollah, on the Lebanon front, I reported on Nasrallah's speech yesterday, but there's also a series of attacks. Al-Samaka, Ruwaiset al-Alam, Malakia, Karnatina Hill, Bayad, Blida, and Rahib, all attacked by rockets, shells, artillery being shelled. So they're just relentless attacks on that front as well. Now, the major news of today's sit rep is that the Ansarallah announced that they have successfully tested a hypersonic missile. Now, this raised my eyebrows. I saw this at the beginning of the day. A hypersonic missile. Hypersonic missiles are not something that very many countries in the world have. I know Russians have it. They've used it in the Ukraine war. The US has a program, but I don't know that they've used or tested one. There's a difference between supersonic and true hypersonic missiles, and true hypersonic missiles that can maneuver at that speed are, as far as I know, only Russia. And now Ansarallah is claiming hypersonic Mach 8, 6,200 miles an hour missiles, which they're saying they tested it. Maybe that's Iran transferring it. Maybe there's a transfer of technology from Russia to Iran. And now it's a transfer of technology from Iran to Yemen. Maybe. I mean, Ansarallah says they've got it, and they didn't say about anything about where they got it. Maybe they developed it on their own. But I don't think, I suspect that if they're saying they have it, they probably have it. I've seen no reason to think they bluff in that sense. There's always bluff. There's always there's that warfare always involves deception. But this particular sense of showing off a new weapon or a new capacity, all I've seen from Yemen, Ansarallah, and Hezbollah for that matter, and Hamas or the Palestinian resistance, is when they show these things, they have them. So that's one major announcement, and there are many mysteries and questions that arise about this, but this is an immense military development, because anti-shipping missiles they've been launching anti-shipping missiles against US naval targets for months, since they intervened to try to break the siege on Gaza. But they for the most part, everything they've launched has been cheap and it's been shot down by the anti-missile systems, but a hypersonic missile is not so easy to intercept by anti-missile systems. So this is quite a formidable weapon. And they said Yemen plans to begin manufacturing it for attacks in the Red and Arabian Seas, as well as against targets in Israel. This is Ansarallah, source to Russian news outlet Sputnik. So that's a little piece of escalation. But then the other piece of escalation, also from Ansarallah, is that the leader of Ansarallah, Malik al-Houthi, said that the following. He says, "We will not only prevent Israeli ships from sailing in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, but also in the Indian Ocean and South Africa towards the Cape of Good Hope. This is an important and significant step, and we have already begun operations related to this." So that is a major deal. And again, if we assume that Ansarallah are not bluffing, this is a really, really big deal. So let me just show you. I'm sure you've got some idea, but let me just show you what this looks like here. Here you have Yemen. And you have the so-called Bab al-Mandab. There's a strait here. It's a very narrow strait. And they have effectively said they have fire control over this strait, and they've told every ship, if you're planning to go here, so the ship will go here, go into the Red Sea, go through the Suez Canal, or go up into this strait here and land at the port of Eilat, or go through the Suez Canal and go to Haifa. So once you're in the Red Sea, you have two options for reaching Israel. If you're shipping to Israel, trying to get into the Red Sea, Yemen, Ansarallah has made impossible. So what ships have been doing is landing here in Qatar, Bahrain, avoiding the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea entirely, landing in one of these Arab countries that are supporting Israel, and taking their goods across Saudi Arabia through Jordan to Israel. So not the same amount of cargo that can travel this distance across the entirety of Saudi Arabia to reach Israel through all these, through multiple countries. You can't get the same amount of goods as you can via sea, a giant sea container port like Eilat or Haifa. So there's already huge costs associated with this. But if you need those goods by sea, what you do is, if you're coming from India, China, if you're all these shipping from Asia, what you do is you go all the way around Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope, the Indian Ocean. You go into the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way around Africa, into the Straits of Gibraltar, into the Mediterranean Sea, and to Haifa port in Israel. Okay, great. So that was the way that so many of these ships had avoided the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, which Yemen was effectively controlling. Now Yemen is saying, you're also not allowed in the Indian Ocean or going around the Cape of Good Hope if your intention is to ship to Israel. So that means nothing coming from any of these routes. So presumably America is not affected, right? Points west of here. So Europe and America, Russia, presumably can get Turkey. All of these are still available to get stuff into Israel. but all the shipping and all the goods coming from Asia and points west are not allowed, Yemen is saying, to go into Israel. So that is, until this point, shipping companies have complained, insurance has complained that going around the Cape of Good Hope and via the Indian Ocean is much more expensive. It adds a lot of new expenses to those that are shipping to Israel. Now that you can't go at any price because you're essentially trying to run a blockade by Yemen, which has threatened to attack any ship bound for Israel. So we can assume that the United States will answer this, threaten escalating war with Yemen, presumably bomb Yemen again, as they've been doing. But it's unclear whether any of that would change the outcome. The Ansarallah in Yemen has said there's only one way to stop this blockade, and that is to end the siege of Gaza and the aggression on Gaza and the siege of Gaza. And if you don't do that, then the blockade will continue and the blockade will escalate. And so Yemen has announced an escalation. Iraq resistance, I haven't heard of an attack by the Iraqi resistance today, but they also announced that they're intending to escalate their efforts. And so that kind of is a good opener for the final thing I wanted to talk about today, which is escalation. So how does the resistance manage escalation? How do they manage escalation? Because I've heard, in a situation like this where we've reached the point where hundreds of thousands of people are being deliberately starved to death. Everybody is watching, and nobody is, the West is just kind of hand-wringing, visiting the starving people, and crying about it as they starve them. Starving and crying, I guess, is the concept that's being applied here. So we've reached that point, and the kind of enraged feeling is there's a tendency to think like, why the people that are doing something about it, namely the resistance, whether it's Iran or Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or Yemen, or of course the Palestinian resistance, there's a tendency to think, well, why can't they do more? Why can't they step it up? And the reason they can't step it up, and you won't hear the resistance talk about it in exactly this way because of the way they're constrained to talk about these things. But we have to remember that the reason it's called asymmetric war is because the West is the side with more power, and the West has more destructive capacity. They have more ability to destroy more than the resistance has. That's always been the case. They have more firepower. This is an asymmetric war. This is a guerrilla war. Asymmetric war is based on the idea that you can defeat a power, an oppressor that has better firepower. And doing so is incredibly complicated. It's very difficult. Resistance movements often are not successful. The oppressed people always suffer vastly more than the oppressor. And the ability to bear what is unbearable comes to be part of why a resistance movement can win ultimately. And so watching it unfold is horrible, but you don't, just because the resistance has shown such incredible abilities, like the ability to destroy, to target and hit armored vehicles with these handheld portable rocket propelled grenades, or these ambushes that we've seen, all of the videos, the resistance videos that we've seen, or now Ansarallah, no, talking about their hypersonic missiles. Just because they have that, just because they've demonstrated these, that doesn't then change the fact that the West has more firepower. The West has more resources, more firepower than the resistance, more economic resources available, more allies in the region, right? As I've gone through Egypt, Jordan, the Saudi kingdom, these are all forces that are working for the West in the region, Turkey. So it's just, the resistance wants you not to be defeatist, right? The resistance is putting out information about their accomplishments and their achievements and their capacities to attack the idea that the West always wins, and the West is going to win this one, because the West, the point of the point of the resistance putting this information out is to try to prove that the side with more firepower does not necessarily lead to victory. But that doesn't negate the fact that the West continues to have more firepower. I just want to make that point really clearly, because otherwise it leads to some confusion about the nature of war and some frustration about why can't the resistance do more, because aren't they moved by the horrors that we're watching? And they are, but if you can imagine what the abilities, the destructive ability that, a commenter, a pro-Israel commenter in the comments for a previous video said something like, Israel hasn't even begun. And it's like, I obviously delete that. I delete all of those types of comments, but they're not wrong in the sense that Israel has nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear weapons and everything in between. So there's a tremendous capacity to destroy and murder civilians across the region, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iran, even if they cannot pull off any of the stated aims of transforming the politics of Gaza, or turning Gaza into a new beautiful resort settlement or something, ethnically cleansing its inhabitants. That none of those things are possible without winning a war against the Palestinian resistance. But certainly we're watching that their capacity to commit genocide, their capacity to use air power against civilians, their capacity to use ground forces against soft targets like hospitals. And I've said this before, if the Palestinian resistance wanted to focus exclusively on soft targets the way that the Israelis have done and focus on committing war crimes the way the Israelis have done, they could do that. They could be firing their Yasin 105s at civilians. They could be firing their, they could be infiltrating into hospitals and murdering the patients inside the way the Israelis have done. But they're not doing that because that's not their strategic conception. But we've seen that that is the Western strategic conception. That is the Israeli strategic conception. And on that continuum of anti-civilian genocidal warfare, the West has much more that they could do that they're not doing. So how do you fight a conventional war or a guerrilla war against a military with superior firepower that has not only a capacity to mass murder civilians, but also a propensity to the mass murder of civilians and a proven willingness to commit genocidal acts and massive support for them in the Western societies and especially in Israel itself. And that is the nature of, that is the reasoning behind the gradual escalation that we're seeing. Because as Nasrallah said yesterday, the strategic vision of the resistance is to slowly see people abandoning the project of genociding Palestinians and stealing their land because it's costly. And they envision people just saying, there's a better life somewhere else. There's a better life that doesn't involve, there's a better life here, maybe, that doesn't involve being a colonizer, that doesn't involve stealing people's land, that doesn't involve murdering children and making TikToks posing with their toys, or just blowing up residential blocks for likes and views. So that's the idea. The idea is to do this in a way that, the word exhausted is the word that Nasrallah was using, to gradually exhaust the will to commit this genocide on the part of those that are committing it, and for them to see that they have a better option, whether it's elsewhere or to stay in the region, but not as a colonizer, not as an apartheid, not as a participant in apartheid, not as a person committing genocidal crimes. And that is something that can only happen gradually if there's some satisfying, if there's some lashing out in revenge that, that is flashy and happens in a moment. Then the Israeli response and the American response will then be to escalate the murder of civilians to another higher level. So that's the impossible situation. That's the reasoning behind what's happening. And it's, for 5 months and more, it's been an open question of whose strategy is going to work. Is Israel's strategy of trying to destroy the indigenous population through starvation and attacking their means of survival, attacking children, murdering families in their homes, destroying all the institutions of healthcare and education? Is that going to win? Is that going to defeat the indigenous resistance, or is the indigenous resistance focusing on destroying Israel's military capacities and their ability to fight, and making it clear that they will endure and they will continue to erode those military and destructive capacities for as long as it takes? These are the two tracks. This is what's every sit rep that I've ever done has been about, and probably will do until this war is over, has been about. these two parallel tracks. And the, the sad part, as we've said in tanky therapy sessions many times, is that most people watching don't even know that there is a military indigenous resistance track. All they see is the destruction, the immense destruction that Israel has wrought in Gaza, and all they see is Israel's continuing deep capacity to do more damage. And so that's the frustration, and that's understandable. But what I've been trying to convey here in all of these 40 plus videos that I've been making is that the resistance to such a genocidal project can't adopt the same methods, timelines, aggressions, objectives as the aggressor does, as the oppressor does. So I hope that that at least gives those of us that are feeling some kind of despair at least a different framework to think about it. At least there's some, I hope it helps you make sense of what Nasrallah means when he says be patient. He's not saying be patient and absorb this damage, although inevitably that's part of it. He's saying be patient and don't give up, because the logic of trying to exhaust the aggressor is ultimately working, and that's what he's looking for, and that's what he's identifying in his speeches. He's saying there are signs of it. They're recruiting, they're reaching deeper in terms of their recruitment. Their economy is suffering. They're asking for more and bigger subsidies and more and bigger transfers of munitions. Even their enraged massacres are a sign of exhaustion. And so that, so just to reiterate, that is the logic. Those are the two different logics at work. Those are the two different strategies that are in play in this war. And the Ansarallah and Malik al-Houthi just announced a major escalation from their side. So I think we'll see how it plays out in the coming days. There are several things to watch. There's how the escalation into the Indian Ocean plays, and there's also whether this promised food aid is going to arrive by sea, as Chris Gunness, an ex-UN Refugee and Works Agency official, Chris Gunness. What I remember Chris Gunness because either one or two Gaza wars ago, he was giving an interview, and in the middle of the interview, he broke down crying, and all of us thought, like, this is exactly how we feel. So, I really look, I'll never not pay attention to what he says, but in this case, I don't see it coming, but I'd love to be proven wrong. So we'll see. Okay, so we'll see. Watch for those things. Hang in there, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.